On June the 8th, 1945, Nazi Germany capitulated. The greatest danger that had ever threatened civilized mankind had been crushed. The people of Britain celebrated victory. Nation had united with nation. Each man and each woman had given everything they could to the common cause. And now it was peace. But was it permanent peace? Peace with plenty. The 51 nations who had united to fight the war now found themselves faced with two problems as urgent as any they had solved. Two problems that no single nation could solve alone. Problem one, security from future war. Problem two, security from fear and from the economic conditions that breed war. And they decided to unite in peace as they had united in war. In the spring of 1945, therefore, they met in San Francisco to draft the Charter of the United Nations.
We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women of nations large and small, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom, and for these ends to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors, and to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security, to ensure by the acceptance of principles and the institution of methods that armed force shall not be used save in the common interest, have resolved to combine our efforts to accomplish these aims. In faith whereof, the representatives of the United Nations have signed the present charter, done at the city of San Francisco, the 26th day of June, 1945.
A preparatory commission was set up and got to work in London in the summer of 1945. On January the 10th, 1946, the United Nations met for the first time. The United Nations is an attempt by men and women to create an instrument which can, if they so wish, solve their problems peacefully. It's not a perfect instrument, but it's the only instrument there is. And upon its success depends not only the happiness and security of the 2,000 million men, women, and children who make up the world's population, but their very survival. It is made up firstly of a General Assembly of all the member states. This General Assembly is, so to speak, the House of Commons of the United Nations. It can consider any question of international interest. It can make recommendations for the peaceful settlement of any international problem. It can refer specific problems to other organs of the United Nations and receive and consider their reports on such problems. And it elects for a period of 5 years a Secretary General to direct the administrative organ of the United Nations, the Secretariat. The present Secretary General is Mr. Trygve Lie of Norway. And as the executive to deal with the first of the two major problems that confront the world, the keeping of the peace, the United Nations has set up the Security Council. This council is always in session. It carries on behalf of the United Nations primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. All members of the United Nations who agreed to abide by its decisions, they undertake to carry out at once, without delay, any action it considers necessary to put down aggression.
It must see that peace is kept in fact. That grave responsibility has been delegated to it under the Charter by all the members of the United Nations.
The Security Council consists of 5 permanent members: China, France, Great Britain, Russia, and America. and 6 non-permanent members elected for 2 years by the General Assembly. Each member has 1 vote, and on simple matters of procedure, a straight majority vote of 7 to 5 carries the day. But there are 2 stipulations, both important. The first is that no member can vote in a matter in which he is directly involved. The second, and you've probably heard a deal about this, is that in all matters affecting action, the majority vote must include the votes of all the 5 permanent members. This means, in effect, that any one of the permanent members of the Security Council, that is to say China, France, Great Britain, Russia, or America, has the power to veto any action called for by a majority of the other members of the Council. This veto power was only incorporated in the Charter of the United Nations after the most heated debates in San Francisco. Here in London, Mr. Nichols of South Africa explains the decision.
The conference at San Francisco justified this right of veto because the 5 great powers would have to make the largest contribution in lives and treasure when force is used.
These are sound reasons. They still stand. But undoubtedly, the veto has been used much more extensively than was originally contemplated. Its use may have to be reconsidered. Even so, the need for big power unanimity when any question of action arises will remain. The United Nations must have force behind it. But force must be based on law. Therefore, if any matter of law arises, the Security Council refers it to the principal judicial body of the United Nations, the International Court of Justice. All members of the United Nations have agreed to abide by the decision of this court. It consists of 15 independent judges chosen from 15 different nations. They are elected by the Security Council and the General Assembly. But suppose a decision of the court is ignored. Then the Security Council will try first to enforce it by peaceful means. There may be negotiation or arbitration. And if that fails, then action follows. There may be breaking off of diplomatic relations. There may be economic sanctions. And if these fail, then the threat of force will be met by force. The armed forces which all members of the United Nations are required to put at the disposal of the Security Council will be called into action by land, by sea, and by air. All plans for the use of these forces are made by the Security Council in conjunction with the Military Staff Committee, which consists of the Chiefs of Staff of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. They are the world's general staff against aggression. The Charter of the United Nations, which established this machinery, was signed on June the 26th, 1945. Less than 6 weeks later, on August 5, 1945,
atomic energy has been liberated. And that fact makes war merely a form of suicide for mankind. And there are other weapons of war whose devastating effect Europe bears the terrible marks. But fear of the consequences of this unity is not enough.
Sir Ramaswamy Mudaliar of India addresses the General Assembly.
Can the atomic energy bomb out the Sermon on the Mount or the 10 Commandments? Can the best designed U-boat sink the Holy Quran? Can the most energetic human torpedo put out of existence the most ancient scripture of the East, the Gita? Is there anything that has been devised or that could be devised by scientists which could obliterate forever the teachings of Buddha or the great tenets of Confucius.
On January 24, 1946, the General Assembly of the United Nations decided to set up a Commission on Atomic Energy, consisting of the 11 members of the Security Council and Canada. The prevention of war was our first problem, and all these organs aim specifically at its solution. These aim at the solution of our second problem, the creation throughout the world of social and economic conditions favorable to peace. 6 out of every 10 men, women, and children living today are threatened with hunger. Millions of human beings are struggling against undernourishment. Millions more against disease, poverty, idleness, misery, and injustice. These are the evils that breed and favor war. For the specific purpose of their removal, they have set up the Social and Economic Council. This council consists of 14 members of the United Nations. It has immense and varied tasks to carry out. It works principally through commissions which it has set up to deal with such questions as human rights and employment, and through bodies called specialized agencies, like the Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, and the Food and Agricultural Organization.
The first is we must see that every ton of food available, I wouldn't say every ton, every pound, every ounce of food available is properly used and not wasted.
The independent member states of the United Nations seek by means of these 5 great bodies to maintain the peace and to serve the interests of the 1,600 million citizens they represent. But many other millions of people live in dependent, non-self-governing territories. The United Nations, being determined to promote their well-being, have decided to set up a trusteeship council to ensure, with due respect for the culture of the peoples concerned, their just treatment and protection against abuses, and to be responsible for their welfare and political development. The machinery is there. We must have the spirit and will to make it work. Miss Ellen Wilkinson addresses the Educational and Cultural Organization of the United Nations.
Since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. That ignorance of each other's ways and lives has been a common cause throughout the history of mankind, of that suspicion and mistrust between the peoples of the world, through which their differences have all too often broken into war. That the great and terrible war which has now ended was a war made possible by the denial of the democratic principles of the dignity, equality, and mutual respect of men, and by the propagation in their place, through ignorance and prejudice, of the doctrine of the inequality of man and of races.
The world is one unit. Unless we solve the problems we have been discussing in this film, we and civilization as we know it will perish. That is why the United Nations was set up. That is why it must succeed.